We have a great panel. 45 minutes is not adequate time to talk about supply chain policy, but we're going to get as much information out in the time that we have. And hopefully you'll have lots of conversations you want to follow up on. And I'm speaking for everyone. We would love that. I have three really great gentlemen here with me who are going to help shed a lot of light on the subject. Before I get started, I've been at MITRE a long time. Welcome to MITRE. Happy to see a lot of familiar faces, and hopefully online we have a lot of familiar and new faces joining us. Supply chain security policy. We want to cover three important grounds. One, the state of supply chain risk management, benefits, challenges to effective supply chain risk management, and what should the future policy direction be? So to kick us off, we're going to talk first to John Boyen, who's from NIST. We're very grateful he's here, Deputy Chief of the Computer Security Division. And I'd like to ask you first, supply chain risks seem to be a focus of the government over the past few years. Are supply chain attacks something relatively new? If so, why now? If not, why so much attention?
Thanks, Julie. So it's been a focus for a number of years. If folks go back to the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative back in 2008. So it is not something new. I think it's something that is fairly complex. So there's a lot of efforts to say, okay, we see the risk. What are we going to do about it? So there's an effort to address the risk. It's very difficult, very complex. It's multidisciplinary. And then there comes these silver bullets, right? Here's a silver bullet that's going to help, but it doesn't. So then it gets to the point of, you know, if I have $10, where am I going to put that $10? And there's this really hard question, so it kind of gets pushed back to the back burner until the next, you know, incident is publicly acknowledged, right? And it's kind of this just cycle. Every few years, you know, 4 steps forward, 3 steps back. And I would say over the last several years, what has been the main difference is, I don't know if it's the number of attacks or the fact that these attacks actually keep the media attention, right? So that it doesn't fade back. And then you have some of the legislative and policy actions that keep it in the forefront. So back in 2018, at the end of 2018, we had the Secure Technology Act, which created the Federal Acquisition Security Council, told departments and agencies to start implementing supply chain risk management practices. And then some of the very well-known cyber incidences and attacks, SolarWinds, have created government policies, an executive order, for example, 14028, that is a massive executive order with lots. I think the last count I saw was like 75 individual deliverable action items, right? So incredibly massive, that has gotten a lot of movement, not only in the government side, but also on the industry side. So I think it's something that, again, it's very complex. Every organization is going to look at it a little bit differently. They look at risks a little bit differently. But at least over the last several years, that ball is rolling and we're still moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. What do you see as the biggest challenges to supply chain risk management?
The complexity. So everybody has a supply chain. So it's where you are in that supply chain. And then when you you look at it organizationally, right? Again, it's a multidisciplinary. People don't go to school to learn cybersecurity supply chain risk management. They go to school to learn supply chain management, maybe supply chain risk management. They go to school to learn cybersecurity or information security. But if you look at it organizationally, it cuts across the organizations, and the very nature of organizations are, you know, they're organized into silos. And so there's a lot of parts of the organization that are just not talking to the other parts to address this very difficult and complex problem. And at the end of the day, the way we look at supply chain risk management is it's that third-party risk. So you have an organization, cybersecurity is really focused on that first-party risk. Supply chain risk is outside that organizational boundaries where there's less control, right? So then you start getting into understanding that risk, which the transparency and visibility becomes less so the further you move out from your organization, and then the control that you have in that supply chain increases or decreases as well. So that is what is kind of fueling the difficulty in the area.
Sure, and as someone who runs enterprise risk management here, there's always the push and pull with, are you going to be proactive or are you reactive, because you have limited people and, time, money, resources. So yeah, that's a very good point. Talking about the U.S. government, what approach is the government taking to address these risks, and what role specifically does NIST play?
Excuse me, thanks. So NIST, by and large, is a technical organization. We're non-regulatory. And through different authorities, principally was the, FISMA gave us authority to develop standards and guidelines. The Secure Technology Act went one step further and gave us the sole responsibility for developing supply chain risk management guidance. So we are a principal member into the Federal Acquisition Security Council, which was, first developed to coordinate and harmonize supply chain risk management activities across the federal enterprise, which is not an easy thing to try to accomplish, because it's a huge enterprise, right? You have non-national security systems, the IC community, organizations that have very different missions. So trying to organize that is not an easy space. NIST's role in that is, one, to be a technical advisor on risk-based approaches. So part of the role of the Federal Acquisition Security Council is exclusion and removal orders, right? Part of the problem that spurred that on was the binding operational directive regarding Kaspersky Laboratories, right? And what took place in the federal government after that to try to remove that threat and risk out of the federal enterprise. And that was a 2+ year operation, and we realized that we were not coordinated. So part of the Federal Acquisition Security Council's purpose is to develop processes to address those risks. NIST's role is to kind of guide that process in a risk-based area. So some might, be asking, well, why hasn't there been any exclusion orders, or, because it's not easy, right? So to develop a risk-based process that doesn't just say, oh, you're from this geolocation around the world, so you must be bad. That's not risk-based, and that's not the approach that NIST advocates. So it's one, it's advising that, and then it's also developing guidance around different supply chain aspects. So we recently released in May Special Publication 800-161 Revision 1, which was an update. And then, of course, since Executive Order 14028 came out, we've addressed in several different aspects. We kind of had a very large part in Section 4 of that executive order, which was very focused on the software supply chain. And probably the biggest gift that we gave from that effort was the secure software development framework, or 800-218, right? Which is the first time. Most of our guidance is really focused on acquiring organizations. This was the first time we kind of went upstream and looked at how software or technology has been developed, and try to create a framework that would allow organizations to attest to certain processes without being specific and direct in what those processes had to be or what to follow. So it's a framework to allow organizations to say, I follow these different practices. So that's kind of the role that we played over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so NIST has done a lot of great work, as you've detailed. last question for now. What do you see more specifically in the government as the biggest challenges to departments and agencies conducting supply chain risk management?
I would say the biggest challenges are probably very similar to along the lines of information security, except for now it's another unfunded mandate. So you're dealing with not only resource constraints, but you're also dealing with an inadequate workforce. And again, it's not that dissimilar, but it does have an impact on addressing supply chain risks. So again, the resources, we're at NIST, we're always looking for it, and we're having a hard time finding it, and I'm sure departments and agencies are in a similar situation.
Yeah, and many companies and organizations as well. Thank you. So I'm going to now turn to Ari Schwartz, who's the Managing Director of Cybersecurity Services and Policies at Venable, a law firm that I have used for many, many years. I'm glad you're here with us. I want you to talk a little bit about benefits, challenges to supply chain risk management, and start with a kind of primer question. What is the benefit of information sharing in the supply chain?
Sure. So we talked a little bit in the last panel about the benefit of transparency and SBOMs, et cetera, which focuses on the components of software, or there's some discussion of hardware as well. You know, knowing what is in your supply chain, which I think is important, a key point, very complicated as we learned. But there's also the question of just knowing your vendors and your contractors and your other partners, and whether they're reliable or not, and how do you make the determination about their reliability. And this becomes a very complicated question as well, even though it's sort of in the macro space and you actually know who they are to begin with. But when you have a problem, is it because they've created a bad product? Is it because they've created an insecure product? Or is it because the company is actually, or the partner is actually malicious in some way? And it's very hard to make the determination about that. And one way to do that is to know what other companies have experienced in the space. So there are a number of organizations and companies that have been focused on trying to share this kind of information. It's very difficult to do because there's a lot of challenges legally and organizationally around it. Not totally dissimilar to the challenges of cybersecurity information sharing, but a little bit different in that way.
Yeah. What do you think the current barriers are to companies for them to be willing to share supply chain information?
Well, I mean, you know, a lot of it is legal, like things like tortious interference, where, you know, are you getting in the way of a contract, either an existing contract or a new contract? Defamation, are you saying bad things about the company? If you're saying that they're malicious and there's no real proof that they're malicious, that it's really malicious in that way. Business or commercial disparagement is another version of that. That's you know, has different kind of levels of being able to prove it. Fraudulent misrepresentation, where you're actively doing it, or you're doing it. It seems that it's more you're doing it because of your competitor and not necessarily because that it's a simply something that you've seen out there. Breach of contract is one that comes up in this space because you have a contract with these people and then you decide not to use them anymore, et cetera, because of bad information's out there. Sharing of trade secrets in some cases, and then just the regular antitrust competition rules in general, if you're teaming up with other people to decide that some software is bad or some vendor is bad.
Yeah. Do you think all the identified risks are legal in nature? And what do you think a law would look like if we could adopt one? A big loaded question. I love
yeah,
this.
I mean, and so I should say, so I worked as part of the DHS Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force in this working group 1 that did information sharing that work in this space, and so they came up with some ideas to address some of those questions, and I don't necessarily think that they're all legal in nature. There's questions about, just do people want to share information about their supply chain, enough information about their supply chain that could be figured out, which is, sort of a question here, or that even that they've had problems in their supply chain. A lot of times people won't want to share that type of information. So I think you still have that barrier out there as well, even if you can get past the legal questions. But the legal questions, as with cybersecurity information sharing, as we saw there, the legal questions sort of pose kind of a first gate to a lot of other questions. Like the lawyers just say, well, we have all these legal questions. Even if we could answer all those non-legal questions, we still have the legal questions first. So if you can get past some of the legal questions, then we might be able to address some of the non-legal questions in a more open way. So I think that they have stymied the conversations about getting big groups of people together to share this kind of information about vendors and in this space. Some groups have done it. There's a group named Create that was out there and now it's turned into a for-profit. There was a nonprofit company that's moved to a for-profit company. I'm forgetting their name of the for-profit company's name, but you can find it out there. Pamela Passman, who was at Microsoft for a number of years, doing policy at Microsoft for a number of years, started it to build this kind of trust in vendors and in ones that it really started more around copyright issues and stuff being stolen and then put out in the marketplace, and what vendors you can trust with that kind of information, but it has moved more into this kind of space as well. There are groups that are out there sharing this information and trying to get to this balance, but we think that the working group 1 came to the conclusion that we really would need a law to get past a lot of the major barriers out there, and it could be done by amending the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act as the I guess it's Chris Krebs' fault for naming CISA after this law existed that was already called CISA. But it used to be called CISA 2015, but now I think we have to call it pull out the whole thing of the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015. That has, in that case, a lot of the focus was on privacy, which is less of an issue here. I think that makes it somewhat easier to get through because even now people are afraid of it being extended. There are privacy advocates out there saying, don't extend CISA 2015 because it will open up privacy issues. But if you just put it to the supply chain test and demonstrate that this is really more about getting people to work together to get past some of these things that are seen as competition issues, we can get there better. I would say there are some ways now that companies can do to share in this space. And one of them, interestingly, is to share with the government. If you're sharing the information to law enforcement first, and then you share with your partners, it's obviously, and you make the point like, I'm concerned about this from a legal standpoint, from a national security standpoint, then sharing it with your partners is a way to open that up and to kind of say, we're not doing this to interfere with the contract. This is really a national security concern that we have here. So if it's that bad and you can get to that point, then that kind of sharing you could do today. There are some kind of like steps you can take to share information today. So I don't want to say it's impossible to do. But it would be a lot easier if we had this kind of amendment to CISA 2015 that did get beyond these barriers for these purposes of sharing to demonstrate security issues and maliciousness.
Yes, so I think that's great and certainly a great way to think about it. As a follow-on to that, would mandatory information sharing raise any implications? What do you think? See that as a barrier, and how do we get through that?
I do think similar to what the last panel sort of talked about on SBOM, you have the problem of like we don't necessarily know what we're looking for yet entirely, and it could grow or it could not grow. But I think DoD deciding what it needs from its supply chain could help that along. So you could have some set of information that's a smaller subset, and some rules around how that's shared and the type of information shared that the DIB could engage in. And there are some of those rules that already exist, but in a way that kind of could be expanded out to the rest of the economy, I think could be helpful.
Yeah, that's a great idea. With cybersecurity information sharing, you touched on this a little bit again before, but privacy was really the main issue involved, and I worked with the DIB right at its foundation, so I remember it very well. What can we learn from that, and how can we make a better case for supply chain information?
Yeah, I mean, this goes to what I was talking about before. I would say, I mean, in this case, I think if you go through the kinds of fields that you would need to be shared about these companies, none of it is really private information. The fact that you know, what the company is, where they are, what programs they've had that have caused problems, et cetera. You don't necessarily have to name individuals and talk about individual information in order to do that. In the cybersecurity context, it's a lot of the times when you're going after something bad that's happened, you know, personal information can get tied up in that. And in the supply chain sense, that's unlikely to happen. And certainly we could design the structure of the system so that never happens, right? And I think that's harder in cybersecurity. So it's that this is actually an easier case to kind of avoid some of those questions. And I think you'd have to do that to be able to expand this law because of the pressure from the privacy groups. Although the privacy groups generally have not complained about the implementation of the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act of 2015, I think there's still this concern about expanding it. So I think if you can demonstrate, like, no, we're really not talking about expanding the privacy piece of this, we're talking about expanding the antitrust competition side of this and some of those pieces that go along with that.
Yeah, clear direction certainly sounds like something we're going to have to seriously consider. And last but very not least, Emile Monette, who is representing an organization. He's at Synopsys, Director of Government Contracts and Value Chain Security. Can you talk a little bit about transparency in the supply chain?
Sure. So thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Transparency is great, right? We talked about we heard about illumination before, and in general, you can't manage what you don't know about. So if you're talking risk management, you need transparency, right? However, you know, what for, right? For what purpose do you want me to tell you this information, right? Why are you asking me for information about my supply chain, information about my products, things like that? What are you going to do with that information? How are you going to protect that information? That's sensitive information to my company, right? That's our crown jewels. And you can look at the microelectronics quantifiable assurance effort. Now the microelectronics assurance framework, I think is how we're talking about it. You can see an evolution, right? Initially, DoD came out and said, hey, we want you to give us all this information about your microelectronics from design through manufacture to packaging and so on. We looked at that, and Synopsys, if you don't know, we are primarily a semiconductor design house, and so we sit way upstream in the supply chain, right? So the stuff that John does, and the stuff that you know Ari's member companies do, trickles down to us eventually. Sometimes you know, greater detail than other. But we you know, started to get these requests from our customers. We pay attention to our customer requests. You know, we're in business. And we really quickly looked at the data that was being requested and kind of chunked it out into 3 buckets, right? The first bucket is, I have that data and I can relatively easily give it to you, but there might be some marginal cost or a little bit of effort required to deliver that to you. The second bucket of data is, I could probably get you to that information, right? I could probably generate that information for you and then create it as a deliverable. But notice the word deliverable, right? There's going to be a cost associated with generating and delivering that data. And so the customer needs to understand that. And then thirdly, there's stuff we just don't want to tell you, right? And we won't. You know, we might tell a foundry customer about our test coverage for a particular thing, for a particular intellectual property core or something. But we're not going to want that then delivered by that foundry customer to a DIB, to JFAC, for example, right? That's just way too much exposure. And so in terms of transparency and policy, you know, I would urge that we kind of do a strategic pause on policy for a second and let the rest of the world catch up, okay? That statutes, OMB memos, all of it. Just give me a minute to like actually get where we are today. And then secondly, continue to engage the private sector, right? The policymakers out there. Continue to engage the private sector and do that in a very robust way so that you can get to an understanding of, oh, gee, there's that third bucket of stuff that you're never going to give me, so might as well not even ask for it, right? And I think that's probably a fair point to stop, right?
Yeah, I've got a lot of follow-up questions, but tell me your thoughts on, I mean, so we're going to have to go back to the third bucket, but I got to think of the right question. I'm going to ask you about that first. So as I see it, let's say we have 3 buckets, as you've said. You've got the data I have and can share with you today, data I can get you and require effort to deliver it, which is how long does that take, and is that the most useful information, and data I will not ever share with you. So on the data, so tell me your thoughts on how we move the needle then. In the data I'm never going to share with you, there still is valuable data we need, and we need to dissociate it with either the competitive piece of it or the network you're sharing with. What are your thoughts? I mean, because obviously you're going to have some of that, because in it, you're going to have a lot of intelligence about where the vulnerabilities are.
Right, right. So one of the ways that we've been kicking around, that we might be able to do this is to say to our primary customer, typically it's a foundry, right, a fab of some variety. Okay, we'll tell you that information, but you're not allowed to share it at all. Now, government can ask you for an attestation that information is there and it's valid and so forth, and we'd be okay with that. So that might be a way to get around it, but I mean, people don't like attestations too much, right? It's only as good as what it's written on or what have you, who signed it.
And it's to the best of someone's knowledge.
Well,
yep.
Right. We those of us in the Esquire world, we put weasel words in there.
That's right. Yeah, that's for sure. So tell me how you see using procurement to drive behaviors. And maybe we can.
Well, I mean, this is, yeah, sure. So if you're serious about a thing, whether it's security in your software, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's, pick your favorite, pick your favorite thing to be concerned about, evaluate your potential offers against that thing, right? Make it an evaluation factor, make it dispositive for the award of a contract, right? Then you're putting your money where your mouth is. And that's really the best way to use procurement. Now, federal procurement is rife, the FAR is about yay thick, right? And it's really thin paper and like 6-point font or something. There's a lot of people on the one end of Pennsylvania Avenue that have put things into the FAR, right? And that continues, right? That's part of why I say, hey, let's have a strategic pause. Our federal procurement system is not just about value for money, right? It's about economics. It's about economic redistribution. Lots of policy reasons why the government purchases things the way it does. In the private sector, generally speaking, it's about value for money. Now we got to make sure that when the policies come down and the regulations and the guidance that we are subject to requires us to do things in a certain way, that we do that, and that just adds cost, right? But nobody's telling us right now, oh, we need you to only buy the most secure thing, right? People are saying, hey, we want technology faster and we want it cheaper, right? And maybe some are saying, we'd like it secure too, but it's still an emerging practice.
Sure, and in
procurement.
Sure. Well, and it's all about risk management and where are you placing the different pieces on the puzzle of risk management. Before I ask questions, and Keith, are we getting questions in? All right, excellent. I'm going to ask each of you. So just final thought before we go to questions, how far should the federal government go with mandates? Do you have any thoughts? I know we're on a pause with you, Emile, but give me some thoughts. We'll start with you, John.
Well, I think it depends on the mandates, right? So there's very specific low-level mandates, and then there's broader kind of performance-based mandates and requirements. And part of that is in the federal government, unless there is a direction, a policy, a law to get movement in the federal government, that's kind of what it takes. We tend to like to do it that soft hammer you were talking about, which is the procurement angle, which I think is fair, but it's also how you develop that policy in the procurement area and the acquisition policies, right? So that it is more performance-based, that it isn't a blueprint across the government, which has very different, risk tolerances and appetites. So the devil's in the details, I guess. I don't find an issue with mandates writ large. It just depends on what they are. So, for instance, I mean, if we're going back a little bit to the questions that you were asking Emile, where it's what are you asking for? So, what we're trying to work with at NIST is instead of asking for that specific information, because we first have to ask why we need that information. We don't want to just collect information for the sake of collecting information unless there's a purpose of that information. So when you're asking for specific information, what do we actually need it for? And is there something else that we can have that's going to, provide us what we need? And so when we're asking for different types of data, is there different artifacts or evidence that organizations can provide throughout the supply chain that provide greater assurance to me without actually getting into either one, intellectual property, or two, information that could actually, if exposed, create a greater risk and vulnerability? So and that's the complexity, that going back to the way you're asking me what's complex, that's where the complexity is that type of mandates. And part of the problem is because it is a complex issue, those developing mandates may not fully understand the impact of those mandates on those that have to comply with them.
Yeah. Ari, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as John's suggesting, and it's a big issue. It's got lots of components to it. So mandates mean different things. I mean, saying the federal government shouldn't use Kaspersky or partners that tie into Kaspersky, that's a mandate, right? And I don't love that way that policy comes about, that you end up with naming a single company, but I understand where it comes from. And I'd prefer to get at it in other ways, so you don't get to that point of having to say, oh, we're picking this one company or creating a blacklist, basically. I don't think is the best way to create a mandate, right? So if you can do it through some set of standards, and we have to implement these standards, and as promote information sharing and do some of those pieces, and come up with sets of things that happen through procurement, I think is a better place to do it than demanding it on the entire economy. But some things might be demanded on the entire economy at some point, or on critical infrastructure first and then the entire economy. So I think there's ways to level it up of how bad is the problem, where are the solutions, how far do we have to go to get an impetus to make this, to get some drivers in the marketplace, to nudge things in the right direction. I prefer the nudge rather than the mandate. But to get to some good nudges, sometimes you need some mandates, right? Yeah. So to me, that's preferable. It's also preferable to have an understanding of where things are going. So if the choice is between, let's mandate this for everybody in the federal government and let's not do anything, I prefer something in the middle that sort of says, let's do a pilot of this at a few agencies and demonstrate how it works, and then expand it out from there.
Yeah, that's great.
If I could
Sure.
Just insert myself here for a moment.
You absolutely.
Thank you. So I just want to talk about an example, right? So we're all familiar with the 889 rule, right? Thou shalt not deliver or use prohibited technology from this laundry list of companies. And then there are subsidiaries, by the way, but we don't have a list of those, so just figure it out. And your responsibility as a contractor is to do a reasonable inquiry, which means looking at your ERP system and running a search on all those names. And okay, I don't have any in my ERP. I can check the box that says I don't and I don't, and we all feel better, right? What has it done, right? I mean, it could be 3 layers, 4 layers down in my supply chain, right? Or it could be an MSP that switches out and uses a camera from somebody that they shouldn't, or whatever. That kind of a mandate, not super effective, right? If we're trying to get to, known bad out of supply chain, that's not the way to do it.
Yeah. Yep. Very true. Okay.
Yeah, we did have a couple questions from the online audience. I'm going to combine them, but would we have been better off if we had just kept all of our products as built in America, not overseas? And what about a master whitelist? You talked about a blacklist. Is there any likelihood that a master whitelist that identifies those supplies that we can use would help us build efficiencies?
I'll at least address the first one. So it's been a long-standing push of, I guess, NIST. I'll definitely say myself, it's been supported by my management, but we're not big proponents of geolocation when it comes to supply chain, right? As Ari was saying, we kind of like the standards and procedures and looking at organizations from that perspective. Would we be better off if everything was in the United States? I think the clear answer is, if you look over the last 20 or 30 years, no. The global economy has, and particularly in the tech sector, has provided incredible innovations at prices that can afford and that diffuse technology throughout the economy that we have all reaped the reward from, right? The question is that has also created greater risks. That doesn't mean we should bring everything back into the I don't even think that's possible at that point. Now, then you get into the complexity of the global economy and what is foreign? How do you define foreign? Is it a foreign company legally, but they have a manufacturing in the U.S. using U.S. employees? Is it a U.S. company that's manufacturing overseas? And then in the supply chain area, right, a lot of these multinational organizations, the mergers and acquisitions that happen in a supply chain, trying to keep track of that on a day-to-day basis just isn't practical, right? So again, I think we need to simplify a lot of things, simplify the complexity to get down to organizational standards and practices, and so that they can attest to that and provide greater assurance. Are we ever going to get down to a level of zero risk? No, it's just not practical. In terms of whitelisting, it sounds great. It's very difficult. Keeping those lists up to date and to actually do it competently, it has to be very narrowly focused. So just having an across the board, what companies are good, right? What does that mean? I think that is almost like creating a blacklist. So if you're going to do, whitelisting or approved product lists or approved supplier lists, it has to be narrowly focused on those critical elements that you're concerned about. So a lot of this goes back to just basic risk management, and that's finding those critical functions organizations have, the information systems that support those functions and the components, those critical components in those information systems. So everything has to be from a risk management perspective. You can't manage, everything equally. It has to be parsed out to the greatest risk.
So I'm going to say even stronger than John did, but in the same light, which is, if you think back, I think of the decision that NIST made, or that was made, I'm not even sure if NIST was the one who made it, but NIST was the one who implemented it, in the 70s on encryption policy, to have an open competition for encryption standards that included the entire world and was not just the United States, to come up with the algorithms that the federal government would use. Is literally one of the best policy decisions in the last 50 years. The idea that we're going to figure out what is the best math here, right? And then use that, and that for the federal government, then the U.S. economy picked it up and the world picked it up, and we didn't have to mandate it to get to the mandate question, right? But it did take the idea of saying we're not just going to have three players in this space that are U.S. and that we trust that are going to do this. We're going to look at the math behind the scenes, right? And so that has led to the entire structure of it's what got NIST involved in cybersecurity. What is the cybersecurity lab today? What is all that work? Comes from that basic idea. And I think that underlying idea is the right idea, and it should continue to be the goal. Is it always going to be the case? No, as I said, at some point you got to say, no one can use Kaspersky. I don't have any problem with the policy of saying that, but I don't think that that's what we should want to do. We should start with the idea of saying, can we have this as an open competition for the world and come up with the best policies that then would spread to the U.S. government, that then spreads to the economy, that spreads to the world economy. That is the best. It puts the U.S. in the best position and the most competitive position internationally, and it also makes us the most secure because we're using the math as the basis for the security. The world's a more complex place than it was in the 1970s. It's harder to do today, but I think that should still be the goal. On the second part of the question on whitelists, I think it's good for a small subset of some organization to have a whitelist of what should be on their devices, but I don't think that works for the entirety of everybody, and because you would end up with a whitelist that included everything. So in order for people to be able to do their basic jobs. So I think you have to get it down to a small enough level that you could use a whitelist, otherwise it's not going to be usable.
Yep. Emile, you want anything? No. Yep, that's great. All right, do we have time for one more question?
Sure. There is one question here. It gets at, could you please address the impacts and risk mitigation strategies caused by the paradigm shift? It says from SCRIM to CSCRIM, caused by IoT and 5G, but I think more broadly it's talking about, the evolution of software and the integration of software with hardware and firmware and how that and getting to these ecosystems and how that has changed the landscape and risk mitigation strategies.
Well, I mean, it's certainly thrown into high relief the fact that software risk is business risk, right? Because everything's connected, and some of us in the community have been saying that for years, right? And it's kind of music to our ears in certain ways, but it's also frightening, right? I mean, I got chips and software in my shoes that's talking to the Nest thermostat that's talking to my car. All of a sudden, my kid has my car,
I'll just say that it's part of that risk management is knowing the impact of technology on your organization. And I think there's a lot of folks that operate technology in their organization are focused on the operation, not the risk of bringing in technology and how that technology works with other technology, because that's where you get into the big complexity. And I don't know if it's even possible to understand the impacts of everything. That's where we get into some of the more recent supply chain attacks. And I'll say it is, I mentioned before, 4 steps forward, 3 steps backwards, but I think in a way, all of the attention the supply chain has received recently is a good thing. Because I think in a way, that means that we are doing a better job of securing our perimeters so that the adversaries have to go into the supply chain. That's a good thing, but it also makes it more difficult because, again, you don't have the transparency and all of that. But I think that the first thing to do is understand the impact of technology on your organization.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. As an enterprise risk manager, I have a lot of notes here of things to take back to my team, so I really appreciate it. And thank you for your time, John, Ari, and Emile. Thanks very much.